past life where he had been the victim of a massacre by the U.S. cavalry, he himself being an Indian at the time. And the whole time he's going through the deep, deep, earth-shaking sobbing, followed by a vow of eternal vengeance against the white man. These words and this bitter rage exploding from a man who was, frankly, as lily-white as I am, Scotch-Irish. And so when he comes out of trance, he says, my God, I can't believe that this was real, but I have no choice but to believe it's real because none of it makes any sense, except that the emotional intensity of the experience was such he could not deny that there was something very real about this experience. This is another example where we... yes.
Let me just ask you a quick question. On a percentage scale, and this may be something that you may not be able to answer, is there a high percentage of people that have these experiences? I'm in that percentage. I identify with what you're talking about right now, so I'm curious.
Well, all I can say is I have no idea what percentage of the general population experiences past lives, accurate past life memories. I know that they're extremely common among my trainings, but then people who sign up for an alchemy training are usually not, simple bricklayers. They are people who already have a deep sense of their soul and its purpose. And I would say among those individuals, probably 95% have distinct memories of past lives. And of these, at least 50% of these past life memories to me feel like very accurate and powerful historical experiences. I'm considerably helped in this by the fact that I am a historian, and I have a great deal of knowledge about many periods of the Earth's history, so I can oftentimes just being given the description of a costume or the landscape or architecture of a temple, I can often determine where this person is in the vast eras of history. Another advantage, of course, is I'm tuned in to the intense emotional experience that people have, so I can readily measure how accurate that past life is. Still, another thing that's very intriguing that proves the existence of past lives is when you meet people that you have known in previous lives. We'll go into that in a minute, but to finish answering your question, I can say that I have no idea what among the general population, how many people have legitimate past life experiences. You see, I know this close to 100% for the people that come to me and my work. I do know that in a Harris poll taken back in the 1980s, it was determined that 40% of Americans believed in the existence of past lives that they had lived before. So, but that doesn't necessarily imply...
A minute ago, why does this seem so familiar? I feel like I've been here before, but I've never been here before. Certain things like that through the years of my life, especially as a child, you kind of sit there and go, I feel like I've been here before. This seems so familiar, but this is the first time I've ever been here. It's really bizarre.
It's uncanny, isn't it, that concept of deja vu? Which can also apply to people, by the way. I mean, I remember one time, and I was sitting at a beach in Northern California, having first arrived there from North Carolina back in 1976, and I remember looking at a woman sitting at the beach and having this distinct and overwhelming sense of recognition. Not only that I had known her before, but that I had been, quite frankly, that she and I had been in some way married, and I began to flush with embarrassment because I knew I had betrayed our marriage. However, so in other words, to avoid embarrassment, I simply turned aside and began talking to some other people, trying my best to ignore her presence on the beach until a few seconds later there was a tap on my shoulder, and I turned around and saw her looking at me with a very angry, accusatory stare, saying, haven't we known each other before? Mm-hmm. And I could say, well, I'm not sure where, but I know we were married. And she looks at me with that same accusatory tone and says, I know! I'm the one in a past life who had forgotten those marriage vows, but she came back 400 or 500 years later, it turns out, to remind me of those marriage vows that I had broken. That's a bit uncanny, exactly. And I've had many, many similar experiences of meeting people.
I believe that.
Past life, yes.
I believe that because in the realm of astrology, when there's been charts I've done and people have said to me, wow, I feel like I've known you all my life, Linda. And I'll look at their chart and I'll combine my chart with theirs and say, oh, you have. We've walked a past life together. It's maybe 200, 300, 400 years ago, but we've lived together somewhere in the past.
Yes, it's so common, in fact, in my work. Remember, too, Barbara, that not all past life visions are necessarily accurate. For example, it's very likely you'll find a dozen people who all remember being Jesus Christ in the past life, or maybe hundreds, and there's certainly quite a few Genghis Khans and Napoleons and Joan of Arcs out there as well. And I'm not going to make that wrong, because oftentimes a so-called past life memory shows up as a metaphorical story of who we are and what our life is about. In other words, as a metaphor for our life purpose. For many people, for example, their Christian faith, historical past life stories tend to be somewhat idealized. For example, if a client goes back to a past life where they are Lancelot of the Knights of King Arthur, striding up to the fabulous gates of the great stone castle of Camelot with the banners flying from the ramparts and sweet Guinevere waving from the turret. The one thing we can be sure about is that King Arthur, if he existed at all, fought out of a small wooden fort in the hinterlands without benefit of war horses, plate armor, or any of the other things we imagine of the Arthurian knights. It doesn't mean, however, that the client's experience as Sir Lancelot may not be a valuable metaphor for them in understanding their life and its direction.
Wow.
That's the story then of historical past lives. One of the other things that really makes sense is when you meet someone from a past life that recognizes who you are and where you've been, like that experience I had of that wife, which it turns out was from Paris in the 1500s. When we go back and meet someone else who shares that past life experience with us, then we know that we have lived that past life before. Now, I was a nobleman in France in the 1500s, and as well as I'm sorry to say, a seducer of women, which brings us to what happened between me and my wife. It was a hobby, I should say, indulged in by many French nobility at the time, noblemen at that time. But I have actually met several women in my present life besides her who all remembered having been seduced and abandoned by me after 500 years. They have not forgotten. Oh, I want all you guys to keep that in mind.
Well, us women. You know us women.
Keep it in your pants. You never know when in the future the consequences will come down. But one of my favorite stories is I actually met the King of France, whom I had served as a musketeer during this time. His name was Francis I. You can read all about him in the history books. Although when I first met him, I knew nothing about French history, and he told me his name was Francis, and the year was 1511, and I basically had to take his word for it until I began doing the research. In fact, even saw pictures of him. Well, the funny thing was, I'm sitting at a hypnosis conference in New England, and I look across the banquet table, and there he is, the King of France. Oh, my gosh, after 500 years. And I looked at him, first thing I said was, what were you doing in the 1500s? Well, his response at that time was he didn't believe in past lives. So after a brief conversation, of course, I'm not here to convert anyone, but a few minutes later, I decided to leave the banquet hall and went up and started playing the piano, and just for fun, I began playing a song that I had written for King Francis 500 years. And there was the king weeping and saying, "What is that song? I have been hearing it in my dreams all of my life. It is my favorite song. What is it? What is it?" And I said to him, "Well, Your Majesty," I said to him, "it was your favorite then. I wrote it for you." He collapsed into tears and said, "Okay, now I believe." What a story.
Wow. That is a great story, David.
Isn't that a great story? I love to be a little more uplifting than the wife that was still mad. Here was the king that still remembered my song 500 years later.
I actually want to share this with you. In the chat room right now, there's a woman that's telling us that her 14-year-old son remembers his past life as a woman who died of an illness. And according to her, it says he gave me a year and an age that she died. Then it says that he told me this years ago and retold it again last year. And he said that he died in his 40s when he was a woman in a past life.
How exciting.
Are children more prone and open to having those past life experiences and regression?
That is definitely true, I would say. Although, I won't say that children respond better to a hypnotic suggestion, although sometimes, very often they do. But more importantly, children often come up spontaneously with memories from previous lives. You know, saying to when they're 5 or 6 years old, often saying to their mommy or daddy, I remember when we were in Rome, or I remember you never used to wash the dishes when you were my son. These kind of comments made in a sort of casual way by our children can be very important clues to understanding who they were and even what our relationship with them was in our previous lives. Although, unfortunately, here in our Christian culture, we tend to denigrate these statements. My own father, when I mentioned one of my past lives to him at the age of about 6 or 7, and it just came up as easily as you please. I said, well, Dad, here's a past life of mine. He said, be quiet, you're making things up, stop imagining things, and like so many other parents in our Western Christian world, my father was a Christian minister, of course, who could not allow that sort of thing in his belief system. He had to shut me up, and this is what happens to children all over America. We don't get to discover naturally who we are as the great curtain of forgetfulness that descended upon us at the time of our birth is slowly lifted by our higher self between the ages of 5 and 7. These visions and intuitions are routinely crushed, but they aren't crushed everywhere. In fact, it was Ian Stevenson, a skeptical scientist back in the 1970s, who determined to find out if there was any scientific validity to past lives, and his research plan was simply to travel to India, where people's past lives are not dismissed, and there speak to young children, finding out what they remembered from their previous lives.
Wow.
He then went on to explore, to whom were illiterate, all these elaborate details about a previous life in a village sometimes hundreds of miles away, which then, of course, Ian Stevenson would travel those villages and find out, sure enough, they did have a citizen by the name of so-and-so and with a wife by the name of such and 4 children and this and that and died of a plague, blah, blah, blah. And this became a powerful book called 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation by Ian Stevenson. So in fact, it is these recollections of children, which in his mind and that of any practical researcher, would prove the existence of past lives to even the most skeptical scientists. In fact, attention, which they don't. They're too busy worshiping at the temple of scientism to pay any attention to real science, if you know what I mean.
Well, no, I believe that. I mean, my daughter, my youngest daughter, when she was 3 or 4, said something. I mean, I don't see it as a past life regression. I just kind of found it kind of strange. I was looking through pictures and I said, "Oh, this was so and so. This is your great grandma. You never got to meet her, but your sister knew her for a couple of years before she passed." And she goes, "Oh yeah, well her name is Nanny, and I've met her before." And my mother and I kind of looked over at her. "What do you mean?" She goes, "I've seen her before. We met before I came here." And I'm going,
yes.
Oh boy, oh boy.
Not only is it common for children to remember past lives, but it's easy for them to remember periods in the between lives states.
Yes.
One of my clients, her little son had said to her, "I'm so glad I picked you for my mommy," as she was holding him one night. She says, thinking he was just telling a joke, said, "Oh, well, that's awfully sweet. I'm glad you picked me." He said, "Well, I did have a choice, as you know. There were 3 mommies I could have chosen from, but I chose you," says the child. In their own simple and naive way, the child was fully aware of what we call the preconception contract, which is one of the specialty areas that I offer as a past life regression therapist. In other words, what is the decision you're making with the council of elders in your inner world, in the world of what we might call heaven? You have to make a decision about coming into a body, a decision about your parents, about your body, about your destiny, about your family life,